Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. Unless you're an early access supporter of this show, this is the last episode you'll hear before the presidential election, which will profoundly shape the state or looming absence of American democracy. The critical importance of the choice between Harris and Trump has much of the country thinking about getting more people involved in politics. And the question of political participation, and particularly how much of it is reasonable, is what my guest spends a great deal of his time thinking about. Kevin J. Elliot is a political scientist and lecturer in ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. He's the author of Democracy for Busy People, and I brought him back on the show to discuss the barriers to democratic participation, the paradox of empowerment, and what it would look like to get more Americans interested in the political process. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Kevin. I have 3 kids. I'm very tired, and I'm very busy. How much democracy do I reasonably need to do?
The amount that you think can fit into your life as it is currently configured, that's consistent also with a reasonable contribution, making some kind of contribution to the world that you want them to live in. So especially with children, you think about the consequences of bad political decision-making, of poor governance, right? It makes a world that's not as good for them. Now, not everyone has children, as we are endlessly reminded in this election. The childless cat ladies of the world, nonetheless, have a say in, or that is to say, have a stake in the future, and should likewise see the amount of democracy that's appropriate for them, the amount of democracy that they can fit into their lives, as something that is up to them, but also should reflect a responsible understanding of the stakes of a given election, of a given electoral choice. So it's up to us as good citizens to think about the future that our democracy is charting for itself into the decisions that we make. And perhaps in a given moment, we can do more for our democracy. If we happen to live in a swing state, for instance, in the present election, perhaps there's more that we're called upon to do. If we recognize the stakes of our election as being particularly high, if we find ourselves in a position in our lives that we can devote a bunch of time to knocking on doors and doing phone calling or whatever it might be, then perhaps we're called to do that in a particular moment. At another time, perhaps the ship of state is on more steady seas, and perhaps considerably less is required of us. But it's hard to imagine that doing less than voting would be called for. And it seems to me that at the very least, even on smooth seas, a citizen should have should have in their life space for paying attention to democratic politics so that they can see whether the stakes of a political moment call for their intervention.
When we talk about people being too busy for politics, and let's think about that in like a self-reported way. So you, Kevin, say to me, Aaron, why aren't you doing more? And I say, I'm too busy. There are a number of things I might mean by that. So on one extreme, it might be, look, I have a lot of stuff going on in my life that I can't possibly get out of because it's either like it's work and I can't give up work because I need to support my family, or it is needs that my family has and I can't reasonably trade those off against other things. And so I legitimately do not have the time, and it would be in a way that it would be, if you had the full context for my busyness, it would look wrong for you to ask me to give up some of those things. The other kind of busyness might be like the corporate executive who never goes to parent-teacher conferences and never attends the school plays or band concerts because they say they're too busy. And we see that as a morally wrong sort of busyness in the sense that they should take time off. They've made a decision. They could have made a different decision. But then there's also a a kind of interest level busyness that is, I have things going on in my life that I am more interested in than politics, and maybe voting is easy, but a lot of the other stuff that requires political participation is just not my forte. It's not, doesn't align with my tastes and so on. And it would seem like if all of those, if the end result of all of those is I'm not participating in democracy to the extent that you think one normally should be, how do we think about that within each of those? Like, should all those people just kind of suck it up and figure it out? Or are there different ways to tease out those kinds of busyness?
Great. Yeah. I'm mainly concerned with the first and third kinds of busyness that you identify here. One that's based on the unavoidable demands of life, and the kinds that reflect our, say, sort of interests. You can say your sort of the sort of balance of your conception of the good life, right? The what you think a good life looks like will have a certain amount of space in it for politics, and that space will vary from person to person. When it comes to somebody who's like actively made choices to shape their life, and they have a lot of opportunities, and they have a lot of essentially autonomy in the shaping of their life, and they've made for themselves a life that has no space in it for politics, but they have a lot of other forms of social power. So as you say, someone like a high-powered lawyer or some kind of corporate executive or something, I'm much less concerned about them, in part because even if they are not themselves taking part directly in politics, they're typically having their social power be felt in other ways. So just sort of set that aside. We can talk about it if you want. But I think the main thing are these other two forms of busyness. And so far as we've sort of framed this, we've sort of framed it as a problem that an individual has, right? An individual has made these choices, or an individual has found themselves in this living situation where they don't seem to have a lot of time. One of the things that's most important, I think, and the perspective I try to bring in my book, is to try to illuminate the linkage between the institutions of our democracy, the way that the participatory avenues are structured, the ones that are open, the ones that are closed, the ones that are, I don't know, they have like automatic sidewalks or something installed, that these are ways of making it easier for these busier citizens to essentially, if you think about it in terms of what is the cost of their participation, what is the cost of to them of being attentive to politics. So for me, the minimum of democratic citizenship, as you say, what do they need to suck up, right? Or that is to say, what level do they need to reach? It seems to me that they should at least be paying attention to politics in a critical way, and ideally, they should have the skills that are needed to intervene should their intervention be called for, according to their judgment, according to their political judgment, their understanding of the stakes, and so forth. That is those costs are something that are shaped by our democratic institutions. So it seems to me that we want to make it as easy as possible for citizens to be able to think, to be attentive to politics, for politics to be, this term I use in the book, to be cognitively tractable. We want politics to be understandable to citizens. We want somebody who might not have a lot of time to politics be able to quickly and easily have access to information shortcuts, to have access to reliable media, perhaps, the information environment. We might want that to be structured in a way that makes high-quality information plentiful, cheap, and easily accessible to ordinary people. This is all just to say that it's not entirely up to citizens to meet those burdens. We want to recognize that the kind of institutions that we have make it easier for the people to make choices about the structure of their lives and to meet the burdens that are more important than politics, right? Feeding your family is more important than politics most of the time. Like, it's hard to imagine. It would be a time it wouldn't be the case. So then the question becomes, how do we meet them where they are? How do we help them to meet the level of democratic engagement that we want from them in order for democracy to flourish, to respond to their legitimate needs, to get their voices heard, to get their interests considered in politics? How do we need to restructure our democratic institution to do that?
There are a lot of interesting claims in there that I want to or or arguments in there that I want to try to tease out. And as you were saying it, I thought of an analogy that maybe this is helpful in clarifying those distinctions. So I don't right now participate in the game of football. I don't play in the NFL. I watch it. I'm a consumer of it, but I'm not a participant in this institution of professional football. And it seems to me that first, if I were to participate in it, it would lower the quality of the institution. Because first, so a big reason one reason I don't participate is it takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of work. I don't have time for that. But even if I had the time, if you stuck me on an NFL team, the product would be worse because I am 5'6" and 145 pounds and am not going to be good on a football field. But the other aspect of it is football is an incredibly complicated game. I watch it, but I don't understand all the intricacies of line play and so on. And so football is also cognitively intractable to me in a certain way. But even there, if you made football cognitively tractable to me, that would also lower the quality of it, because part of what makes it such a good game is how complicated it is. And so in politics, it seems like there are people who vote poorly, who don't know what they're talking about, who want bad things for the country. If they don't vote, we could make the case it's better that they don't vote than that they do. But also governing a country as large as ours with a government that's as complicated as ours is incredibly complicated. So I spent over a decade working in DC public policy circles with colleagues who really knew different policy areas. And it just became very quickly clear to me how tremendously complicated something like the economics of healthcare access are. And that most of us who kind of spitball an answer to it just have no idea what we're talking about. And so it seems like making busyness less of a problem is a concern on both of those directions, that more participation from people who right now are not is going to lower the quality of the output, and that also a high degree of this complexity is just necessary. And so somehow making it less complex would make it less effective.
Yeah. So taking the concern about sort of including people who we might think from a certain vantage point is better to not have their input. Here, I would to take your example of football, just consider what is the excellence of football consist in? As you say, it would lower its quality, and that implies an estimation of its excellence, like something that what does its quality consist in? And I think there's often an implicit assumption in these kinds of debates when democratic theorists in particular talk about it, that the quality of a democratic system is somehow reducible to its policy output, something like that, and that there's a sense that it would output better policies with better inputs from citizens, something like that. Now, if we rethink, though, I think if we take a step back and we think, well, what actually do we want from a political system? What do we want from a representative system? I think a natural answer is to say, well, we want it to be responsive to the legitimate interests of everyone who lives in society, something like that. And that's a place where, well, when we remove the inputs of people, as wrongheaded as they might be at a given moment, we deprive the political system from the information that it needs to achieve excellence on that understanding of what it is to be excellent, right? So insofar as football is just fundamentally different than the kind of thing, right? It's not the kind of thing that we have players do, and their performance of the excellence of the game of football is entirely separate from the audience, right? From the watchers, right? From the people sitting in the bleachers. So it seems to me that the question then becomes, well, how do we translate the inputs of citizens to policy outputs? That is one question. And another one has to do with this question of complexity, as you say. Delivering good policy is almost always, let's say, in any given policy area, you begin to dig you find that the bottom is very deep indeed as we try to reach good policy. So here, this is like a challenge in a way for mediating institutions, including political parties, but not only political parties, but also matters of public administration and the linkage between policy elites, policy-making institutions, let's say policy executing institutions, bureaucracies, things like that, and electoral institutions. I think these are fantastically interesting conversations that don't actually necessarily need to be done in the electoral arena. And this is in some ways what I'm talking about with respect to the simplification of electoral choice. In my book, I use the example of a website. A website has a front end and a back end. This is like the terminology used by designers. The front end is what users encounter. When you open up a web page, you have, you see the content that you see the windows that you see, there's things you could click on, there's things that will respond to you, and things that you click on that won't. And a well-designed website is simple. The things you click on operate as you would expect, and you can navigate it without a huge amount of frustration and complications. The back end of a website can be infinitely complicated because the people who are upkeeping that are either the operators of the organization, their service providers. There's often lots of different subsystems that are involved in the back end of a website, and it can be fantastically complicated in all the ways that are needed in order to deliver highly complex services to users. Democracy, it seems to me, can work in a similar kind of way. We should make the front end as accessible and simple for citizens as possible. The back end, we can allow complexity to spiral very, 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 very far. Now, that does raise a difficulty, or that does raise a challenge, I should say, for mediating elites. And above all, here we're talking about representatives and political parties who are, in a way, they're sort of on the front lines. They're in that interstitial space between the front end and the back end. It does make it a difficult task for them, but it seems to me that it's not an impossible one. It is, they can fail. I agree. There's no doubt that they can fail in their task of explaining, here's what we're doing back here in the back end, and here's how it's going to benefit you. I think a lot of our politics right now is about this kind of seeing the playing out of failure and partial success, right? Success and failure and so forth in these political communication strategies. But that seems to me to be a perfectly understandable and a not intrinsically sort of objectionable way to balance these things. Because ultimately, if we do want our representative system to represent everybody, to respond in some way to their interests, it's very hard to do that without their input. Information asymmetries between the people who are in a position to manipulate public policy, if they don't have any input from the people who they are attempting to benefit, we have lots of excellent examples of how that can go wrong, just through ordinary, biases and garden variety forms of limited perspective. Just other people's lives are not transparent to us, so we need some kind of information transmission capacity. Elections are one way to do it. There might be other ways, but it seems to me that cutting people out of that feedback process is going to guarantee dysfunction in the way that what I'm suggesting at least opens the door to the kind of thing that we would like to see from our institutions.
I want to turn to those reforms which make up the second half of your book, but I want to just jump on the website analogy for a moment because I think it raises some interesting questions or distinctions. In terms of, so listeners might be familiar with the notion of voice and exit as ways to change one's situation. And that was what I immediately thought of as you gave this, because anyone who has, multiple times I've run very large websites. I've run websites that have various external and internal stakeholders, as they're called. And the website example is the complexity is in the back end, and the end user doesn't see that, but they're using the thing. And so the measure of success for them is whether it first is capable of doing what they want it to do when they came to the website in the first place, whether that's giving them information or allowing them to buy a product or look up how to drive across town. Um, and and then if it is capable, whether the user experience is such that they can achieve that, it's easy. It's an easy user experience. Um, that's what matters to them, but they're not typically telling the people making the back end, here's the other stuff that I would like this website to do. Or if they are, everyone who has worked on these kinds of projects knows most of those suggestions are bad ones. Like, one of the problems with trying to build a website for a large institution is the people at the top will often have, and all sorts of people will be like, well, you should add this feature, and you should add this feature, and you should add this feature, and why don't you do it this way? And they've either wildly underestimated the amount of time, or that feature would actually make things worse, or like a website that was designed in a democratic process would be a bad one. And so the way that websites get improved is essentially exit. It's not voice. I think Apple Maps launches and it's terrible, so I'm going to use Google Maps. And then Apple puts a lot of time into improving things. But that's quite distinct from a democratic process, because outside of those of us who are wealthy enough to up and leave to other countries, you can't switch from Apple Maps to Google Maps. You get the one designed by committee. And so does that pose a problem for this story of participation?
I think it would. It invites questions about essentially matters of let's say constitutional design. So the metaphor here is we're talking about is the Constitution in a broad sense, right? We're talking about the fundamental institutions structuring politics. That's like what the website is, right? Front and back end are these, refer to these different dimensions of the constitutional order. So yeah, here I don't take a strong stand in the book regarding the sort of appropriate structure for constitution writing. I have been thinking about this in the subsequent couple of years since I wrote the book and since the book came out. But the basic, and I wouldn't say that I've entirely settled on one view, but here are just a couple of thoughts that I've been having about this. There's this old saying, probably many of you, the listeners, have probably heard this, right? The idea that you may know where the shoe pinches, but that doesn't mean you know how to make a better shoe. And there's a sense in which those two tasks are fundamentally distinct. So I would say that we want our and this is a comparison that one of my intellectual influences, Jan Elster, has written about. So he would say something like, citizens can tell you when the shoe pinches, right? So they can give you proper feedback on sort of the how they find conditions to be. But they can't necessarily tell you how to make a better shoe. And so that latter consideration is about what you're talking about, right? Oh, I would love this website to, like, I don't know, make me able to fly through the air. It's like, yeah, we can't do that. That's not going to work, right? Those types of suggestions are not helpful. There's this like when Homer Simpson is invited to design a car. It's like, I want fins, and it's like, this maybe not the big. These are not useful for designing a high quality vehicle. So this is just to say that our Constitution writing process, our process for designing institutions, is not necessarily one that lends itself to highly participatory participation. I don't necessarily see that as a huge problem. The kinds of things that I'm concerned about, more or less, I don't want to say they assume a stable set of democratic institutions. I do think we can change things at the margin in ways that we can have democratic input into them. This is where my thoughts are fairly. I'm still working through some of these issues, and indeed, like in the field, this is a very the idea of participatory constitution making is sort of very much in the. We are talking about it among democratic and constitutional scholars. There's a new piece there's a new edition of Critical Review is going to have a bunch of essays on these topics. Actually, I have a contribution that's going to be going in that fairly soon. In any case, so basically, I admit that you are identifying a tension here. It's one we're not sort of unfamiliar with. but I don't think we've entirely worked it out. There's ways in which you can say that Constitution writing and construction is a legitimately elite, as it were, process. And so then the question is just how do we, are there ways to bring the public in? Is that even necessary? I don't necessarily have a problem with a process that gives us a institutional setup that gives busy people a voice. But busy people might not have needed to have a voice in the making of that system. I am ambivalent about that.
We are recording this 50 some odd days out from the election. It will be released. You, the listeners, are listening to this much closer to the election than that. It is I don't think it is controversial to say this is a rather important election, even by the standards of presidential elections. Typically, there's a lot of bad information out there. There's a lot of people who feel discouraged and don't like the candidates, don't want to participate, although that seems to have gotten a bit better with Biden dropping out and Kamala Harris coming in. The enthusiasm gap has narrowed there. But thinking about this context, what can we be doing to ameliorate the problems of busyness? What are some of the practical steps that we might explore, either like immediately right now or kind of just looking ahead to institutional reform, cultural reform, whatever? What are some of the things we can do to allow busy people to participate and participate well?
So, one of the most straightforward defects of American elections is our system of election registration, of voter registration. We see almost every election these days, at least in the last couple of decades, states will engage in voter roll purges. The term purge is it's a little bit of a political football, because of course everybody recognizes that a voter roll should be kept up to date. Right? Maintenance is a legitimate task. Now, in the U.S., we make it the legal obligation of citizens, of individuals in most states, to register themselves to vote. Importantly, this is not a tradition that goes all the way back to the founding kind of thing. Nobody decided once upon a time that, if you want to vote, you actually need to do two things. You don't only have to cast a ballot, you have to go at some indeterminate period before down to register to vote. This is an artifact of the progressive era. It's a progressive era reform that's introduced right at the tail end of the highest level of voter participation in American elections, which is at the tail end of the 19th century and the first few years of the 20th century. Then you have these registration systems that are introduced, and you see this absolute drop in voter participation rates. There's a number of reasons for this. I'm making it sound like it's only because of registration. There are other things going on at this time. But the people who introduced these systems were attempting to complexify the process of casting a ballot. This was intended, in many cases, to raise the costs of voting, to make it more complicated for people to vote, and to make it easier for election officials to deny people the right to vote. We see this in Jim Crow states, but it's also happening in states where you have new migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe coming to states that they are not particularly welcome in. And the powers that be would love to have the opportunity to prevent them from being able to register to vote and indeed to cast a ballot by making it, to add this hoop. So what does this mean today? Well, we're seeing this in states that are removing people from the voting rolls in very short order before the election. We have different registration dates. The last day to register to vote in different states varies, right? So in some states, that deadline has passed. Even as we're recording this, by the time the listeners are listening to this, almost every state will have if you did not register to vote, you will not be able to vote, very likely, on election day, even if you're realizing a few days ahead of time, oh, actually the stakes of this election are very high. I would like to do that. The best practice reform in this vein is same-day voter registration. So there are states for which I believe one of the Dakotas was one of the originators, or that is to say, the had this system in place. You just show up on election day. You fill out your voter registration at the same time that you cast a ballot. It's no problem, and this entirely essentially eliminates this particular complexifying, cost-raising feature of American elections. Automatic voter registration is another thing that some states do. There's a lot of holes in that system. Same-day voter registration is the way to go. There are a lot of other things that we could talk about, but that's like a very a very simple way to decomplexify the front end of our democratic political system. Another option that we have in some states, in American elections, tend to have a lot of options on the ballot. State to state, this might vary. I came of age in the state of California, where we often have a lot of initiatives on the ballot. And so it can be very overwhelming to get to go into a voting booth, is for me going in as an 18-year-old, 20-year-old, young adult, and be like, I don't know what the comptroller is. I'm not sure exactly what the, city council, why are there 8 judges I need to vote? Not really understanding what all these offices are and what the significance of these choices is. It can be quite daunting. So some states have at the top of a ballot, they just have an option that you just want to, if you would like to cast a straight party vote, instead of going office to office, you have one thing you tick at the top of the ballot, and that does it wouldn't register a vote for initiatives, direct democracy, referenda, and things like that, but it would solve the problem of the long ballot for offices. So the long ballot is a bit of a challenge. Is one of these costs. Having an none of the above option, or a straight party ballot, straight party ticket option at the top of ballot is a way to reduce that. Or you could just make more of these offices appointative. That is to say, you could put more of them under the authority of higher level offices to appoint. Allow governors to appoint their own agriculture commissioner, for instance. The state of Kentucky I used to live in, we had an independently elected agriculture commissioner. Did I know what they did? No. But nonetheless, I was asked to register a vote for them. I elect a governor. I would like him to have his agenda advanced by the people who are administering the state government. Let him be the one who appoints this office. If I'm a busy citizen, that's a way to make my choice easier, to decomplexify politics and to make my participation more tractable.
For that to work, to solve the problem or address to at least some degree the problem of busyness and democratic participation, does it assume a certain level of institutional and party health? Because as you were talking about this, it occurred to me that if the parties and the institutions are particularly unhealthy, then what you've just described might not increase meaningful participation. So that extreme example, like we make it really, really easy for everyone to vote, but then we just take 50% of the votes and throw them in the trash. We haven't really increased participation. We've increased the appearance of participation. And some of the stuff that you described, like making more things appointments, takes the participation, the line between my decision and what actually happens in the world is smaller. Parties that are dishonest or obfuscate what they're going to do, and I don't think this is hypothetical, like the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 has become a really important part of this current presidential election, because what it represented was the hard right of the conservative coalition, which unfortunately controls much of the conservative coalition, putting down very explicitly, these are the policies that we want and we would seek to realize if we win. And it turned out that when this version of conservatism actually articulates their policies are wildly unpopular. Most people reject this to the point where the Republican nominee is running as far away as he can from any association with that. But that's not, that seems to be indicative of parties. You're voting for the person because of vibes. You're voting for the person because they're saying they're doing one thing, but then if they really do Project 2025, then that also doesn't feel like participation. And so it seems like in order for what you've just described to work, we need institutions committed to transparency and honesty, which seems to be a problem right now.
Right. So the way that so you're getting at, I think, something that I emphasize in my book, and it's something that I have been sort of yelling at my colleagues who are interested in particular, the importance of political parties. You're speaking about political parties. There's been some growing interest among people who are writing about democracy, what does it take for democracy to do well. There's been some recent interest in political parties in the last 15 years or so. And believe it or not, there wasn't a lot written about political parties that wasn't fairly negative, even by people who are writing in a more sort of theoretical, political sciencey mode. Well, I don't want to say political science, but like theorists, certainly. One of the things that a lot of this recent work has done is they're saying, parties are very important for democracy. But I would say only when they face competition. So essentially, a lot of the pathologies that you're talking about here, that you're hinting at and you're alluding to, are a function of the incredibly segmented and incomplete competition that American political parties face. The fact that in more than half the states, probably I shouldn't say more than half the states, but that in a large majority of the states, like I'm not sure exactly how many, you have effectively single-party government is truly astounding. If you think about it from a comparative politics perspective, the most minimal definition of what a democracy is that we have in political science is one where incumbent governments can lose elections. And that's effectively not the case in most of the democracies that compose, right, the United States of America, that is to say, state governments. That is I've just got to emphasize it. That signals a degree of democratic. We are tempting democratic, the gods of democratic failure, something like this, right? And so, an awful lot of what we identify as defects of democracy are in fact because the American political system has got some deep pathologies. Because what I've just said, we've got states that are dominated by one party. The only way to really fix that is to impose by force, uniformly over every state government, a form of multi-party democracy, and that is, to put it frankly, very difficult to imagine. Even articulating as like a goal within the current political system. In my book, I talk about two-party democracies versus multi-party democracies as basically rival ways of organizing the party system of a democracy for the purpose of encouraging wider participation. As you say, when you throw away half the votes, and in some cases more than half the votes, is depending on what level we're talking about. You're talking about a system that is really not very responsive to the majority preferences of the population, and so absolutely right. When you're in a polity that votes 60-40 for one party, and you're in that 40%, your participation has much less value. It's sort of, I don't blame you for saying, why should I pay attention and why should I even vote, right? Given that my vote is not really going to make a difference. Now, there's two responses to this. One is that because we have such a long ballot, it is typically the case that even though there might not be competition at one level of government that you are able to vote for, there might be for a different one. So I used to live in the state of Kentucky, which is a very, very red state. I lived in a very, very red district. James Comer was my member of Congress, who, if you know, was very, very conservative Republican. But the governor of the state when I lived there was Andy Beshear, right, who's a Democrat. So even though there was no competition for state rep, state Senate, state, that's to say, federal House or Senate, the governor's race was competitive, right? So I did have some competition on my ballot ultimately. Nonetheless, my point here is simply that it would be great if we could get more competition in our politics, forms of multi-party competition, multi-winner elections, which would be where we have where we join together some of our congressional districts or our state legislative districts, and then allow there to be 3, 4, 5 winners from a given district. This would enable smaller parties to emerge, so you could actually have, as we say in political science, a choice and not an echo of what the public would want in our elections. Because, of course, as you say, even within the Republican Party, there are different factions. There's a hard right faction, nationalist, anti-immigrant faction. There's a pro-business, more moderate faction. There are social conservatives. All of these might have their own political parties that would be able to compete without cannibalizing each other's ability to win an election, which is what it currently would be under a two-party system. Yes, so competition would discipline parties and would eliminate some of these concerns.
Changing voter registration rules would make it easier for people who want to vote to do so. But I wanted to turn to 2 other topics that you discuss in the book, which say, okay, we've got people who might be able to participate, but aren't participating. They're not voting, they're not engaging in politics. How should we think about, say, so mandatory voting is one thing. Something, I mean, the more extreme is sortition. We're going to kind of press people into service to participate in politics. Are those options we should be exploring?
So yeah, probably your audience is probably might be somewhat scandalized by the idea of mandatory voting. But in fact, it has a long and noble pedigree. Indeed, even in the United States, it might surprise surprise most people to learn that both Massachusetts and Virginia, among others, Delaware and Maryland as well, all required in the colonial period had provisions, either laws or indeed parts of the charters required people to vote. The state of Massachusetts now, its state constitution has a provision allowing the state legislature to make voting compulsory, and this was added in 1919 to the state constitution. And this is just to say that mandatory voting, I think, is best sort of conceived of as a best practice institution for representative democracy. And the way I defend it in the book is as a kind of tutelary institution, right? Insofar as we are in a position to, the default in most liberal democracies is if you do nothing, the institutions of our democracy don't expect anything from you. So the default is that you do nothing at all as a democratic citizen. This seems to me to be too little. It's asking too little of you. Something more is required of you. Mandatory voting just flips what that default is with respect to voting. And it says, look, the default should be that you turn out to vote. And what we see empirically, that when people expect to vote, that they undertake they expend some effort to become informed, at least minimally informed. So in mandatory voting states, comparative knowledge assessments find that there's very few people who know nothing at all about politics. The number of people who are on the very lowest rung of political knowledge, or I should say, people who are not even on the ladder of political knowledge, know nothing at all, that group of people is made much smaller in a mandatory voting state. You don't see people don't become like, dynamic political experts or anything, but they expend a little bit of effort to become a little more informed. And it seems to me that, so you were talking about the concern about people being sort of low information voters, and maybe you might be better off without them. Empirically speaking, what we see is that it changes people's incentives to become informed, as a matter of fact. Some people have also suggested, so turning to sortition, so mandatory voting, it seems to me that there's a good case to be made. It would actually improve information. It would improve the responsiveness of representative institutions. Um, in general, big asterisk here, when you don't have competition, um, I'm perfectly willing to admit that, like, why should you vote when we already know who the winner is going to be? It's like, well, yeah, but that's a problem with the competitiveness of the system. It's not a problem with anyone. Setting that aside. So turning to sortition, which is something that a lot of democratic theorists have been very interested in. One proposal that's been floated is also with concern with, like, the quality of the vote and the informativeness of voters is, well, what if we say that the only people who get to vote are people who win a lottery? So we say that there's only going to be 100,000 voters, maybe a million voters, say 100,000 voters. And if you win this lottery, then you get to vote. And that all of a sudden turns your vote from something that, like, you have to do and everybody has, every Tom, Dick, and Harry has a vote, into something special. Now all of a sudden you actually, I'm going to go learn because my vote matters a lot now. And in fact, one of these proposals says that what if so we're randomly selecting who will be the voters, but then also we have mandatory voting for these randomly chosen citizens. And perhaps we even require them to participate in some kind of deliberative assembly or something in order to consider their vote. These seem to me to be in some ways fairly fanciful. I don't take them all that seriously, and that's perhaps a little bit maybe a failure of imagination on my part. I do worry about the quality of who's going to accept those invitations. Right, you're going to have selection out, and maybe if 90% accept, that's pretty good, and that's a heck of a lot better than we have when it comes to a lot of these random selection mechanisms. I was just at a conference where someone who's done hundreds of these has said our uptake rate, our return rate when we invite somebody to participate in a deliberative forum is typically 6 to 8%. I'm not saying that's what's going to be the case for an imagined enfranchisement lottery, which is what I've just described. But you're going to have biased opting out. And it seems to me that that's going to be a problem for the representativeness of those types of institutions. I don't know if you have a more specific design of sortition in mind. I'd be interested to hear.
No, I mean, I think the two concerns that I have about it are, even if most people don't vote right now, if you restrict that, you're basically restricting access to voting by doing one of these proposals, because you're saying everyone outside of the 100,000 doesn't get to vote. That even if that 100,000 is representative in a meaningful sense, they represent a cross section of society. My concern is people are going to feel unrepresented by outcomes, even more so than they do right now, by outcomes that go against their personal interests, particularly if there are outcomes that are harmful to them. The other issue that I have with it is, we didn't bring this up, but you talk about it in the book, the paradox of empowerment. And as I was talking about that, I was thinking about, I used to live in Alexandria, Virginia, in a community with an HOA, and it was a whole bunch of condos. And one of the things that we really liked when my wife and I moved in there and had one kid and then eventually two more in that neighborhood was there were playgrounds throughout the neighborhood. And the playgrounds needed repairs at some point. And there was a big fight there because the HOA, which was primarily made up of retired people who had the time to have accepted a position on the HOA, I think one of them actually said, this neighborhood really is more of a retirement community, and we shouldn't have these playgrounds. And someone else said something like, the playground is right up the hill from me and it's loud to hear children playing at it. And of course, those of us who had young kids, who also were people who worked full time and weren't joining the HOA, had a rather different opinion about the character of the neighborhood. But the people who were able to accept participation into this deliberative body of the homeowners association were going to be cranky old people who didn't have kids and wanted the neighborhood to reflect their interests. And so both of those seem like, so can you, I guess, That's a long-winded way of saying, those are my concerns with this, but can you also talk about this paradox of empowerment? Because it is, I think, a fascinating conundrum for a lot of very pro-democracy people who think that just giving more people access is always good.
Yeah. So the first concern about sortition as causing citizens to not identify with the outputs. I think this can be stated fairly straightforwardly in terms of like the thing about a random selection procedure is that nobody authorized you to make a decision. Right. This is the big issue with one of the big issues. There's a few of them. Accountability is one. If you've made a bad decision but you don't face re-election or anything of that nature, you're just randomly selected in, and then you're done. You make a decision and you're out. There's problems of accountability and there's problems of authorization, and that's sort of what you're describing there. I think that's a very serious problem, and I don't. I am quite skeptical personally of giving sortition-based bodies decisive power over large issues of public policy. I think that they can play an important role in informing decision making. I think one of the best designs is to have a deliberative body decide on the wording or even perhaps the topic of a referendum. For instance, you might bring one of these bodies together to consider some public policy issue and then to frame or not a law or a referendum question to be put to the public, which would then provide a certain check for their deliberations and would allow the people then to recognize that they authorize, if not the decision of the body, then their recommendation. The paradox of empowerment is, I think, one of these things that we've kind of many people have thought about, but I don't think we've put as squarely in the crosshairs of our consideration about designing institutions and what a good democracy is and how democracy can fail us. And this is why I've made it very central to my book and the way that I think about democratic empowerment. So the paradox of empowerment occurs when we have some institution, either we've instituted it or we're proposing it, and we think what it's going to do is it's going to open up new avenues into the halls of power, right? We're going to throw open the doors of the Capitol. Don't allow the image of January 6th in your mind here, right? But actually, maybe that might be a good image. You throw open the halls of power, and the idea is that people will flood into it, right? And in a positive way. If you build it, they will come. Sometimes is the way I've expressed that hypothesis. The idea is the reason people aren't participating more is because the only way that we give them to do that are these like shallow, fairly meaningless forms through voting or whatever. But actually, what we often see, and what we see again and again and again, and I give a bunch of empirical examples of these in the book, is when you open up new paths for people to participate. Typically, the groups who are able to make use of them are the usual suspects of social influence and advantage. People who are wealthier, people who are older, people who are, in some cases of like the developing countries, you'll have people of higher caste, right? Sort of the elders of the community. People who already are recognized in the community as being of higher social status, and have the advantages to take advantage to foot the costs of participating in these bodies. A lot of them involve very costly forms of participation, in-person meetings, multiple meetings where we take a decision over time, where we consider lots of evidence. These are extremely expensive ways of making collective decisions, and busy people who have 3 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids, who are working multiple jobs, don't have the time to participate in these things. Your example is a quintessential one, is a perfect instance of the paradox of empowerment, because who ends up empowered by this local deliberative body? I like the way that you put that. The HOA, one way of describing what that is, it's a local participatory deliberative body. Isn't that great? Aren't we hearing the voice of the people? And it's like, no, they meet in the middle of the day on work days, right? This is just not, these are the structure of the structure of the body, the nature of its meeting times, and the way that its decisions are made by the people in the room during a meeting, right? Something, if you have an institution that's organized that way, is going to necessarily bias who ends up being empowered by it. And so it seems to me that we might get very excited, very energized by certain proposed reforms to our democracy. Oh, let's get the ordinary people together and have them talk about the issues of the day. But who ends up showing up? Older people, retired people, people without children, more educated people is in particular one group who really gets advantaged by these types of institutions, and they might be better than the status quo. Don't get me wrong; I'm not like prejudging this. If you're saying if some critics who advocate these types of institutions will look at electoral institutions and will say, but the rich are able to, buy elections, whatever, have disproportionate influence in elections. And at least when we have sortition, the wealthy won't have as much influence in these institutions. I don't want to prejudge that. That in some ways it's an empirical question. I'm skeptical personally of that particular advantage line of argument, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that institutions that advantage slightly more educated but not truly audaciously wealthy people, maybe that's better. But whenever we're thinking about trying to improve our democracy, we should always have in mind, is this going to be a perverse instance of the paradox of empowerment? If I could just say one more word about that, if you're kind of skeptical about that idea, one of the best, most straightforward examples of this is campaign finance. If you think about giving money to candidates as a form of political participation, right? You say, let's open up the doors to people to participate. Here's a way you can do that, right? Many people would recognize that, this is actually a way of participating that empowers one particular group of people in a way that's very obviously not open to everybody on equal terms, right? If you have more money and campaign contributions is like a form of participation, it's very obviously the case that some people leaving this path of empowerment open is going to empower one group of people and another group of people not nearly as much. And so if we're concerned about equality in our elections, it might be the case that regulating, limiting this form of participation would actually improve democratic equality. And that's the intuition that the paradox of empowerment is supposed to help us access.
In our closing few minutes, I want to loop back to the question that I opened with in the context of, again, people are listening to this very close to a presidential election, assuming they're listening on the release day and are subscribed, and you all should be. And so thinking a lot about democratic institutions, political participation, political decision-making, and democracy and being democratic citizens. And so I asked at the beginning, I'm busy, and so how much democracy should I do? And we spent a lot of this conversation talking about voting, which is one way of participating that is a not everyday sort of thing. It's, for some people, it's a once every 4 years sort of thing. We talked a bit about participating in deliberating, but that was a way to get at then what does a vote look like? How do we structure who gets to vote, and then how those decisions that lead to those votes. But I guess what I want to ask is, repeating that first question, how much democracy do I need to do? What kinds of things can or should listeners be doing beyond voting? Like, is this conversation that we're having right now that we're going to release online, is that doing democracy? Are there effective things that as good democratic citizens we should be doing above and beyond simply voting?
Yeah. There's been some interesting work on this, right? So your question of are we doing politics now? Are the listeners listening to this doing politics now? There's this book that came out a few years ago called "Politics is for Power" by Eitan Hirsch. Perhaps you're familiar with it. He lays an indictment on people like you and I who spend a lot of time, and indeed probably most of your listeners who spend a lot of time reading about politics and perhaps talking about it on social media. He calls these types of activities political hobbyism, and he calls people who engage in it political hobbyists. And he thinks that he has, I think, a very interesting argument that there's a way of doing politics that doesn't look like politics at all, and that is being somebody in your local community that your neighbors rely on. Know that they can rely on you for. So if you have an older neighbor who needs help, or not even needs help, that you go and chat with them, right? You make yourself a part of the lives of people in your neighborhood, in your immediate vicinity. That this is a way that Hirsch says that we can build power. We can build our own political power, because eventually an election season, as you say, every 4 years, or every 2 years, as the case may be, every 1 year, as I cheekily suggest at one point in my book, that becomes an opportunity for these interactions that we cultivate with people in our immediate social milieu to become suffused with political content. In other words, we have a social connection with people, and then we talk politics when politics becomes an issue in our moment. And that's when somebody might actually listen to you. Political persuasion, which we study in political science, is very, very hard. It's very hard to change people's minds about things. In part because if somebody comes and knocks on your door, you don't know who they are. You don't know whether they're trustworthy. In many cases, you don't know if the information that they give you is reliable. But if somebody has been coming to your house and chatting with you on a daily basis, and they're your neighbor and they live right over there, right? And then they tell you something about politics, and you have some reason to trust them because you've built a basis of social trust with them. There's a way of understanding that type of thing as a kind of politics, as a type of attempting to build power. That might be a way of thinking about democracy as a kind of social form, as a way that we organize our social lives, that we, through our ordinary interactions with other people, we build up connections that we don't have to hive off politics categorically from these connections. That it's okay to have that be a part of that, and it doesn't have to be something that divides us necessarily. I think that's one of the things that in these days of high polarization and affective polarization, if we come to understand, we often hide our politics because we're afraid, right, that our neighbors won't like it very much, right? Indeed, as I said, I lived in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, and got to say, there was a lot of difference between myself and some of my neighbors. But actually, it ended up being fairly okay. We had social connections with each other, and it worked out. It was actually not a huge source of tension in any serious way. In fact, transcending any kind of tension was a kind of victory for neighborliness, which I think it has an independent value, but also has a political utility. So there's that. I think it's important to try to bear in mind when we're doing hobbyism. I think it's an important thing to have in the back of our minds, especially as high information, highly politically interested people, and to bear in mind that politics can find its way into our lives, but we should also should not allow it to block our human connection with each other, if you will, for lack of a better term. Sort of our common humanity ought to always sort of transcend our politics, but that doesn't mean we need to put politics entirely aside. So find politics in the spaces that you occupy in your life, and find a way to spend time with people that you don't necessarily spend time with in other ways. This is, in some ways, get involved in your community, but also in just walk around your neighborhood, say hello to people if you can. And make yourself a part of their lives.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
I would argue that once we accept that private property is a social institution rather than a natural institution, and we also recognize that laissez-faire had to be planned very carefully in some cases by the state, we recognize that what kind of regime of property entitlements and economic organization we have can't be conceived in terms of should the state play any role at all, but what role is the state going to play and what kinds of economic organization is it going to incentivize?
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.